Hey folks, this is Russ Jones with Answering Alex, Responses to Cosmic Skeptic. This is a new series that I've decided to create, essentially just responding to the objections that are created by Alex O'Connor, also known as Cosmic Skeptic, who's become quite the YouTube sensation, and rightfully so. Alex is a thoughtful commentator from the atheist or agnostic perspective, and his politeness is endearing to everyone in the community. So I hope that I can show the same sort of kindness and charity in my discussions regarding his objections, and at the same time elucidate some of the problems that I see with those objections. I'll go ahead and begin by saying I am not a professional philosopher, just like Alex, and I hope that most of my viewers see the value in engaging with these types of discussions, even if you're not a professional. It's wonderfully enjoyable to think about these deep existential questions, and I should hope, especially the fellow Christians who view this, should find within them the responsibility to love God with their mind. And one of the ways that we can accomplish that is by thinking through these arguments and reflecting upon them. So the way this is going to go, this is episode 01, is I'm just going to respond specifically to individual videos with Cosmic Skeptic. They might be on his channel, they might be on other channels, but I'm not going to try and lump together a bunch of different things. I'm going to do just one video at a time in response to one video at a time. I'm also not going to waste your time by restating the entire argument that was in the previous video. The video that I'm responding to is worth you spending the time to watch, and then you should watch my response if you have the time. I no intention of stealing any kind of views from these types of debates. In fact, you probably won't get much sense out of my discussion if you haven't. So this in particular is in response to Alex O'Connor's debate or discussion with Cameron Bertuzzi of Capturing Christianity, which is a fantastic podcast, blog, organization led by Cameron that brings together great Christian thinkers and defends the faith, and also the unbelievable radio program, which is, well, it's frankly unbelievable. It's great. If you want to hear thoughtful discourse about Christian issues and issues in theism, you should subscribe. So this is a response to that particular video. I've put a link to it in the description so that you can watch it first before coming here, and then hopefully you'll return and you'll get some of my responses. Now, to begin, whenever discussing anything philosophical, I like to start with definitions. If we don't have proper definitions in place, everything just goes to hell in a handbasket real quickly. So we'll start with some of the standard terms that you'll hear discussed in the debate. The first one is necessary. In light of the contingency argument, the word necessary here just simply means cannot fail to exist. There is no possible world in which this being does not exist. It must exist. So that's all that necessary means. Contingent is juxtaposed with necessary in that it is dependent upon something else for existence. So there is a dependency relationship. One phrase that isn't mentioned a lot in their discussion, but I'm going to mention it quite a bit, is a third option, which is a brute fact, which is something that exists inexplicably. There's question about whether or not brute facts exist, but I feel like we need to have them in the discussion because it's part of the literature. And then finally, Alex introduces a different concept that's not quite as frequently discussed with the contingency argument, which is the phrase determined. We're dealing with determinism. And I take determined to mean fully entailed by its cause. That is to say, an event, an object, or a being is determined if the cause which preceded it entailed that effect. The effect had to happen after the cause. Now, before we go any further, I just want to look at these definitions really quickly. There is no clear inconsistency between something being determined and something being contingent. In fact, one could argue that they're very good bedfellows. You could say, for example, that if something is fully entailed by its cause, that it is fully dependent on its cause, or at least it depended on its cause this time. So any objection that begins with maybe everything is necessary because of determinism doesn't really follow. You can believe in determinism and believe in contingent facts about this universe. So at any rate, we can jump right in to some of the responses to Alex. One of the statements that he made was, and I quote, "If it had to exist, it was determined to exist." Now let's return back to our definitions. What does determined mean? It is fully entailed by its cause. But what does had to exist mean? Well, that means it cannot fail to exist. Well, if something cannot fail to exist, does that mean that the only way it cannot fail to exist is by being determined by something else? No. In fact, the very argument itself is based on the premise that one possible explanation for the existence of something is that it's necessary in its existence. It is literally uncaused. And so to make the claim if it had to exist, it was determined to exist, is false, because there are other options. If it had to exist, it could be necessary in existence, or it could be determined to exist. Another claim which he makes, although this one is paraphrased a little bit, is why is it okay for God to be self-caused, but not for determined objects to be self-caused? This is another confusion. At no point does Cameron or any Christian apologist claim that God is self-caused. That is an obvious incoherence, like a square circle or a married bachelor. If something caused itself, it would have to exist in order to cause itself. So it would already exist. It's nobody's claim. Instead, the claim is that there are certain things that are necessary in existence and therefore are uncaused. On top of that, you could also have brute facts that are uncaused potentially. So at any rate, this objection just doesn't really stand, because we're not saying that God is self-caused. We're also not saying determined objects are self-caused. Nothing is self-caused. Now, Alex goes on to raise an objection here that I actually think is a decent objection. But before we jump into it, I do want to respond to the way in which he phrased this objection. He began with a statement that it seems like you're making an argument from shallow common sense. And I want to be charitable here as much as possible. But in general, I find this common thread amongst atheist or agnostic responses to theistic arguments quite regularly posed as if our most obvious and immediate deliverances of our senses and our perceptions should not be trusted, that they're just shallow common sense or something of that sort. On the contrary, I think that unless a argument is proposed that defeats that deliverance of my senses or perceptions, that I'm fully rational in believing it to be the case. If I am, as Alvin Plantinga gives a really good example of this, he describes a person who sits outside for lunch one day and then comes inside and has been accused of stealing something or committing a crime inside the building. But he remembers sitting outside, and he remembers eating lunch, and he remembers not being inside. And he then says, how much evidence would be required for that person to be rationally compelled to give up the deliverances of his senses and his perceptions? And he goes even so far as to say, somebody testifies that he was in there doing it and saw him do it. But then what he Would he say, oh, I must have imagined eating lunch? Even if there is videotape evidence, it would have to be really strong to make a person admit or come to the conclusion that their perceptions were completely false. They're common perceptions, they're simple perceptions. If only for the case that if their simple perceptions were false at that point, their simple perceptions now of the videotape are just as likely false, as would be the perceptions of everybody else there who's trusting the videotape. So just in general, and I'll do this whenever I see it in arguments across the web as I continue the series, but at any point, if anyone begins an argument with asking you to deny the most obvious intuitive parts of your understanding of the world, make sure that they provide an argument that is strong enough to defeat that. It needs to be more than just poking a hole or raising a question in order to make you abandon stuff that's that important. But Alex does actually raise an objection here. He raises the objection of how do we know contingent objects exist at all? And that's a fair question. But I don't think it's a difficult one to answer once we've decided what our definitions are. If a contingent object is something that's dependent for its existence, and a necessary object is something that cannot fail to exist, then it's pretty easy to see that contingent objects do exist. For example, take Alex himself. There was a time, in fact, 13.5 billion years or more, in which Alex failed to exist. And then he was born and he existed, which means that he is contingent because he is not necessary. Now, some of you might notice that I raised the definition of brute fact early on, which is something that exists inexplicably. So while it is true that the argument of Alex coming into existence means that he's not necessary, it doesn't guarantee that he is contingent. Perhaps he is not contingent, but he is a brute fact. Well, there's a problem with saying that he's a brute fact in that in order to say that no contingent objects exist, we must then replace all of them with either necessary objects or brute facts. And if we say that everything is brute fact, then we're saying that everything is inexplicable, ultimately. And that kind of deep skepticism isn't particularly becoming. You can swallow that pill if you want to and say that everything is inexplicable because everything exists without a reason and it's not dependent on anything else. Or you can admit that things are contingent, at least some things are, because they come into existence. Now there's another response that you'll hear sometimes on the web, and I'm not saying that Alex raised this, which is that nothing actually does come into existence, that instead everything is just a rearrangement of things. That's like saying, behind me is not a ping pong table, it's just an arrangement of atoms ping pong table wise. And we've just given a concept to its shape. Well, this is really close to mereological nihilism, which would state that there are no composite objects, that instead everything is just the initial parts, and it just gets rearranged. This is an even bigger and harder pill to swallow than saying that everything is a brute fact. Because if you do this, the radical implication is that there is no actual self, that the person standing in front of you is no different than what's left of them after you set them on fire and turn them to ash and CO2 and whatever else is released in the consuming fire. As long as you believe that composite objects have different properties from their parts, that is to say that a car is different from the parts that make it up, then you have to disagree with this way out. And I don't see any other ways around getting past this argument that contingent objects exist because there are things that failed to exist at one point in time and do exist at a different point in time. In fact, we could make this claim about the universe itself. If the universe began to exist, then it is contingent unless you use one of these other ways around, neither of which are particularly convincing. All right, so at another point, Alex raises what's known as the composition fallacy. And in what is classic cosmic skeptic response styles, he does this very charitably and very politely, and starts by saying he's not quite sure if it commits the composition fallacy. Instead, he provides an example of what that composition fallacy is. So the classic example would be that you have bricks that make up a wall, and in one case, you know that all the bricks are red, so it's safe to infer that the wall is red. But you also know that all the bricks are small, and that it's not safe to infer that the wall is small. So what is it about smallness that makes it so that you can't infer that the combination of the things are small is retained, but you can about color? Why is that retained? And this is a really interesting question to deal with. I'll tease it out a little bit, but then I'll give a thought experiment that I think will help us on our way. The thought experiment goes something like this. Instead of thinking about the bricks as being red and small, let's think about them in terms of their property and the property value. So the bricks have the property of color, and the color is red, and the value is red. The bricks also have the property of size, and the value is small. And so the question is, as we accumulate more bricks, do the properties change, or does the value of the property change, or do neither? And when we put two bricks next to each other, the property of size does change. And so we don't need to look at the whole composition to know that it would be false to assume that the size would remain the same by adding all the bricks together. If we put two of the bricks together and we see that their color remains the same and they retain the value of red, then it is safe to say that, or safe to infer that the wall as a whole will be red. And so in that thought experiment, we can do the same thing with contingent facts. We'll start with a simple one. I dropped my girls off at daycare today. And that's contingent, at least for the sake of our argument. And the reason it's dependent upon is because school's out. It's spring break. And now there's another contingent fact that I can think of, which is that the backyard is green. And that fact is contingent upon the fact that I've been watering and fertilizing it so that it's actually growing grass. Now the question is, when we ask the first fact about dropping the kids off, we think it's safe to say that it needs an explanation, and we provide it. And then when we ask the second question about the grass, we also think that it needs an explanation. Now, if we put those two facts together and say, I dropped the kids off at daycare today and the grass is green, do we somehow now lose the need for an explanation because both of those contingent facts are together? It doesn't seem to be the case. It doesn't seem to be that we have lost the need for an explanation. It doesn't seem that that property and its value disappear or change in any way, shape, or form. It needs an explanation. And this is an important way of looking at the contingency argument, You see, most interpretations of the contingency argument that are put forward these days talk about what's called the big conjunctive contingent fact, the BCCF. And what it's saying is that we're not looking at all of the facts as a composite object. Instead, what we're doing is we're just listing them all out in just a really long sentence. And there's no reason to think that at some point, by adding another contingent fact, in fact, by adding the final contingent fact about this universe, that for some reason we should arbitrarily stop needing an explanation at that point. It doesn't seem to have any reason. If it didn't apply at 2 facts or 3 facts or 5 facts or 10 facts, why would it stop applying at all the facts? And this is actually presenting what I consider to be the juxtaposition of the composition fallacy, which is the taxicab fallacy, which is to say that a certain principle applies and then you arbitrarily at some point stop and get out of the taxi and say, nope, doesn't apply anymore. And since we're talking about just facts in a sentence, I don't really see why once we've gotten all the facts listed that we would stop needing an explanation. So I don't think the composition fallacy applies here. In fact, I think anyone who says that the BCCF doesn't need an explanation of its existence is committing the taxicab fallacy. All right, so those are the biggest objections that are made. The next objection that is made, it's only raised briefly, and I'm not even sure if Alex was the one who brought it up. I think Cameron might have, but he mentioned, why can't the universe be necessary in its existence as opposed to relying on God? I think there are a couple of responses here that are appropriate. The first would be clear. If the universe did begin to exist, then obviously it's contingent because it can't fail to exist. And if it failed to exist at some point, then the universe is contingent. The other is really a visualization that I like to think of. I don't know how many of you have seen attempts to depict the B series of time, in which they describe our universe, and it looks sort of like an expanding conic section, and at any point along it, you could take a slice, and that would be where the universe is now, and you end up with this 4-dimensional space-time. So the 3D part of it is kind of the world in which we live, but left to right represents the arrow of entropy or of time. And the way I like to think about it is that the contingency argument isn't asking us to explain up or down or left or right in terms of explanations. We're not trying to describe why yesterday was the way it was, and we're also not really trying to describe right now why everything is the way it is. Instead, we're trying to describe why there is an outside and why there is an inside. Like, why does this model itself exist? And it seems to me that that is a fair question to ask, and one that does cry out for explanation. It doesn't seem reasonable to me that the universe would be necessary in its existence. That the universe would have to be exactly as it is. But that's an intuition, and admittedly, intuitions are different from people to people. So at any rate, there are 2 other small objections that are raised. At one point, Cameron makes the argument for maximum simplicity, and Alex responds that the Trinity is not simple. I think that this this was a petty objection. I don't mean like in a mean way, but just it's just not really an appropriate objection to the problem. Cameron made it clear that maximum simplicity of an explanation increases its intrinsic probability. That is to say, the simpler an explanation is, the more likely it is to be true. But it is not the only thing that matters in an explanation. And by no means did Cameron say that it's the only thing that matters in an explanation. So a defense could be made for the Trinity as being better at explaining more of the data than the simplest possible explanation. And as long as it does explain the data better, then no objection is needed. For example, many apologists would argue, for example, that for God to be perfect, that God would need to be loving. But if there is no creation, God can't love unless he's more than one person. If he is singular, then he can't be loving. And that would be an explanation for why there would need to be multiple persons in the Godhead. Or you can make an argument from Revelation to say that because the Bible is true and give arguments about why it's true, then the Trinity is true, something of that sort. And finally, I thought this was interesting. Alex ends with this. He says, God is just another something. And I thought this was fascinating because what he's applying here is God is just another something that needs to be explained. And you hear this a lot in atheist discussions where they say that concluding with God only raises more questions. And I just think that that's false. In this particular example, he's right. God is just another something in this discussion, but he's a necessary something. And that's the point, that he necessarily exists. And if he necessarily exists, then the argument has succeeded. Stating that God is just another something doesn't actually refute the argument in any way, shape, or form. So, at any rate, it seems like a bizarre objection to end on, but it is what it is. Well, thank you for hearing me out. I hope some of you find this interesting or valuable, and I will see you the next time I record. Thanks.